A young doctor finally gets to go home on Christmas Eve after years of missing dinner with his aging mother. Then the hospital intercom sounds an emergency heart surgery with no surgeon available. The patient's name sends a chill through him, Richard Caldwell, the billionaire whose decisions took his father's life 12 years ago. He could drive away, but instead he chooses to go back and save the man. And when the truth from 12 years ago is exposed, how will the billionaire face the doctor who saved his life? What happens next will leave you stunned. Before we continue, tell us what time it is and where you're watching from. Subscribe and hype because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of St. Mark's Hospital hummed their usual monotone hymn as Dr. Elijah Moore stripped off his surgical gloves and dropped them into the waste bin. His shoulders ached, the kind of deep, bone-tired ache that comes from standing over an operating table for 6 hours straight. Through the narrow window of the scrub room he could see the parking lot below, already half empty. Christmas Eve had a way of clearing out even the most dedicated staff. Elijah was 34 years old, though the lines beginning to form at the corners of his eyes suggested someone who'd seen more than his years should allow. He was tall, lean, with the kind of quiet presence that made people step aside in hallways without quite knowing why. His hands, steady, precise, almost unnaturally calm, had guided a woman's failing heart back to rhythm just hours ago. Now those same hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. One new message. From Mom. "Whenever you're ready, baby. No rush, I'll keep dinner warm." Elijah stared at the words. No rush. She always said that. Had been saying it for 8 years now. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every birthday he'd missed because someone's aorta was dissecting or someone's bypass graft was failing. His mother never complained, never guilt-tripped, never asked for more than he could give. Which somehow made it worse. He scrolled up through their message history. Last Christmas, whenever you're ready. The Christmas before that, the turkey can wait. And the one before that, you save lives, Elijah. That's what matters. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to type something meaningful, something that captured the weight of what he was feeling. Instead he wrote, "Leaving now. Be there in 40 minutes." For the first time in nearly a decade he was actually going to make it home for Christmas dinner. On time. While it was still Christmas Eve, the thought felt strange. Foreign. Like trying on a coat that used to fit but had been hanging in the closet too long. Elijah pocketed his phone and pushed through the double doors into the main corridor. The hospital at 6 in the evening on Christmas Eve had a peculiar quality, not quite empty but hollowed out, like a seashell abandoned on a beach. The gift shop was dark, the cafeteria had closed early. Even the usual parade of visitors had thinned to a trickle. "You're actually leaving." The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, one of the cardiothoracic fellows and the closest thing Elijah had to a best friend in this sterile world of stainless steel and antiseptic. Marcus was leaning against the nurse's station, a coffee cup in one hand and a half-eaten candy cane in the other. His scrubs were rumpled, his black hair sticking up at odd angles. "I'm leaving," Elijah confirmed, and the words felt like a small rebellion. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "No way. Doctor, I'll just check one more. Charts more is actually going home before midnight. Don't make it weird. Too late. This is already the weirdest thing that's happened all month." Marcus fell into step beside him as they headed toward the elevators. "Your mom's gonna lose her mind. In a good way, I mean. When's the last time you made it home for Christmas dinner?" Elijah pressed the button for the ground floor. "I don't remember. That's because you never have." The elevator dinged, the doors slid open with a mechanical sigh. "I know," Elijah said quietly. They stepped inside. The elevator was empty except for a janitor's cart in the corner and the faint smell of pine-scented cleaner. Marcus hit the button for the parking garage. For a moment neither of them spoke. The numbers ticked down, 5th floor, 4th floor, 3rd. "She never says anything," Elijah said suddenly. "That's the thing. She never asks me to come home, never makes me feel guilty. She just waits." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good moms are like that." "Yeah." Elijah's voice was rough around the edges. "Yeah, they are." The elevator reached the ground floor but didn't stop. Marcus had pressed the garage level button and it continued its descent. Elijah watched the numbers change, his reflection ghosting across the polished metal doors. He looked tired. Older than 34. His white coat hung open over his scrubs, his ID badge slightly crooked. When had he become this person? This man who lived in a hospital, who forgot what his own living room looked like, who measured time in surgeries instead of seasons. His father would have hated it. The thought came unbidden, sharp as a scalpel. His father, Thomas Moore, a postal worker with calloused hands and a laugh that could fill a room, had died when Elijah was 26. A heart attack, a bad one. He'd made it to the county hospital, but the wait had been too long. The equipment too old, the staff too stretched. By the time someone saw him, it was too late. Elijah had been in medical school when he got the call. He'd driven through the night, but he'd arrived to find his mother in the waiting room, her face blank with shock, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying but had forgotten the words. That was when he'd decided. Cardiology. He would learn everything there was to know about the heart, how to fix it, how to save it, how to keep it beating when it wanted to stop. He would become the kind of doctor his father had needed, and he had. But somewhere along the way he'd forgotten to be the kind of son his mother needed. The elevator reached the parking garage. The doors opened onto concrete and shadow and the smell of old exhaust. Marcus stepped out first, jingling his keys. "You taking the highway or surface streets?" Marcus asked. "Surface streets. Less traffic. Smart. Listen, tell your mom Merry Christmas from me, okay? And eat something that's not from a vending machine for once." Elijah managed a small smile. "I'll try." They walked together through the garage, their footsteps echoing. Elijah's car, a modest sedan that he'd bought used 5 years ago and barely drove, was parked near the back. Marcus's truck was closer to the entrance. When they reached the point where their paths diverged, Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Go home, man. Your mom deserves it. And so do you." "Thanks, Marcus. Anytime." Marcus headed toward his truck, whistling something that might have been a Christmas carol. Elijah continued alone, his keys already in his hand. The garage was mostly empty now. A few scattered vehicles, their windshields frosted with the first bite of winter cold. His breath plumed in the air. 40 minutes, that's all it would take. 40 minutes, and he'd walk through his mother's front door. She'd hug him. She always did, no matter how long he'd been gone, and then she'd insist he sit down while she heated up dinner. The house would smell like roasted turkey and sweet potatoes and that apple pie she made every year, the one with too much cinnamon because she knew he liked it that way. For the first time in years, Elijah felt something close to peace. He reached his car, unlocked it, and tossed his messenger bag onto the passenger seat. The interior was cold, the leather seats stiff. He started the engine and let it idle for a moment, waiting for the heat to kick in. His phone buzzed. Another message from his mother. "Drive safe. Love you." Elijah typed back quickly. "Love you too, Mom. See you soon." He meant it. This time he really meant it. He put the car in reverse and began to back out of the space. The garage exit was just ahead, a ramp that led up to the street and freedom. Beyond that, home, dinner, his mother's smile. A normal Christmas Eve, the kind other people took for granted. Elijah Moore, for once in his adult life, was choosing family over work, and as he drove toward the exit, the weight that had been sitting on his chest for years began, ever so slightly, to lift. Elijah had just reached the exit ramp, the stripe of yellow paint on concrete that marked the boundary between hospital and world, when the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Attention all available cardiothoracic staff, we have an emergency bypass surgery. Dr. Reeves is unavailable due to illness. Repeat, we need a cardiothoracic surgeon immediately. Patient is prepped and waiting." The voice was calm but urgent, the kind of controlled panic that came from years of training. Elijah's foot eased off the gas pedal. His car slowed but didn't stop. "Not yet," the speaker crackled again. Patient name, Richard H. Caldwell, 72 years old, acute myocardial infarction with complications. We need someone now. Elijah's car stopped, not because he'd made a conscious decision, not because his brain had processed the information and weighed the options. His body simply stopped. Foot on the brake, hands on the wheel, heart suddenly loud in his ears. Richard H. Caldwell, he knew that name. Of course he knew that name. For a long moment, Elijah just sat there in his idling car, halfway between leaving and staying, the headlights cutting through the dim garage like twin accusations. Behind him, Marcus's truck appeared, slowing as it approached. Marcus rolled down his window. "You hear that? Yeah. You think anyone's gonna take it?" Elijah didn't answer. His hands were still on the wheel, knuckles pale. Through the windshield, he could see the exit just a few yards away. Beyond it the street, the route home, his mother's house, the turkey, the promise. "Elijah," Marcus's voice was closer now. He'd pulled up alongside. "I heard it." "Caldwell," Marcus said quietly. "That's the billionaire, right? The real estate guy." "Yeah. Man." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's gonna be a circus. PR, lawyers, everyone's gonna be watching that surgery." He paused. "Good thing you're not on call." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Yeah, good thing." The speaker crackled a third time. "Final call for cardiothoracic staff. Patient Richard H. Caldwell. Anyone available please report to OR3 immediately." Static. Silence. Then nothing. Marcus shifted his truck into drive. "They'll find someone. They always do. Come on man, your mom's waiting. Let's get out of here." But Elijah's car didn't move. "Elijah, you go ahead." "What?" "I'll catch up. I just need a minute." Marcus frowned through his open window. "A minute for what?" Elijah's voice caught. He swallowed hard, tried again. "I need to think." "Think about what?" "You're off duty. You're not on call. Someone else will handle it." Marcus's tone shifted, became almost pleading. "Dude, don't do this. Not tonight." Elijah turned to look at him. Even in the dim garage light, Marcus could see the conflict written across his face, the war between duty and desire, between who he was and who he wanted to be. "Go home, Marcus." "Elijah, please." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, his expression somewhere between frustration and resignation. "Your mom's gonna kill me when she finds out I let you stay. You're not letting me do anything. This is my choice." "Yeah," Marcus said. "That's what I'm afraid of." He rolled up his window and drove past, his taillights disappearing up the ramp and into the evening. Elijah watched him go, and then he was alone, just him and his car, and the echo of that name. Richard H. Caldwell. Elijah put the car in park and killed the engine. He should leave. He knew he should leave. There were other surgeons. The hospital would figure it out. They always did. And his mother, God, his mother had been waiting for him for 8 years. 8 Christmases of cold turkey and reheated mashed potatoes and sitting alone at a table set for 2. But Richard H. Caldwell. Elijah pulled out his phone. His mother's last message was still there on the screen. "Drive safe, love you." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He started to type, then stopped, started again. "Mom." That was all he could manage. Just that one word. He deleted it. What could he possibly say? "Sorry, I heard the name of the man who destroyed Dad's hospital and now I can't leave." That sounded insane. It was insane. 12 years ago, St. Luke's County Hospital had been the heart of the community. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't state-of-the-art. But it was there, and it served people who had nowhere else to go. People who couldn't afford places like St. Mark's with its marble floors and private rooms and coffee shop in the lobby. Then Richard H. Caldwell's investment group had pulled funding from the Municipal Health Initiative, a routine business decision, the newspapers had said. The money was needed elsewhere, more profitable ventures, nothing personal, except it had been personal. St. Luke's had closed its cardiac unit 6 months later, and 8 months after that, Thomas Moore had died waiting in an understaffed emergency room because the nearest hospital with proper equipment was 30 miles away. Elijah had been 26, in medical school, drowning in debt and textbooks and the overwhelming pressure of trying to save lives he didn't yet know how to save. He'd come home for the funeral. He'd held his mother while she wept, and he'd made a promise to himself, to his father's memory, to the ghost of a man who'd worked every day of his life and died because the city couldn't afford to keep him alive. He would become the kind of doctor who could save people like his father, and he had. He'd done it. He graduated top of his class, completed his residency, become a cardiothoracic surgeon. He'd saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds if you counted the long-term cases, but he'd never saved his father. And now on Christmas Eve, Richard H. Caldwell, the man whose signature had sealed St. Luke's fate, was lying in an operating room upstairs, his heart failing, his life hanging by a thread. Someone else could save him. Someone else should save him. Elijah's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Please tell me you're on the road." Elijah didn't reply. He sat in his car for another 3 minutes, then 5. Then 10. He watched the garage entrance, hoping to see anyone rushing back inside. A surgeon who'd been on their way home but had heard the call. A resident eager to prove themselves. Even one of the older attendings who'd stayed late. No one came. The speaker remained silent. Somewhere upstairs, a man was dying. Elijah closed his eyes. He thought about his mother, sitting in her kitchen, the oven light on, a plate wrapped in foil. He thought about his father, who'd believed in doing the right thing even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And he thought about the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm, but also I will remember that I remain a member of society, with special obligations to all my fellow human beings. Even the ones who'd taken funding away from hospitals. Even the ones who'd made choices that killed your father. Elijah opened his eyes. He looked at his phone one more time, his mother's message: "Drive safe, love you." He typed slowly, each letter a small betrayal. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Emergency surgery, I have to stay. I'll be there as soon as I can. I promise." He hit send before he could change his mind. Then he got out of the car, locked it, and walked back toward the elevator. His legs felt heavy, his chest felt tight, but his hands were steady. Because that's what they'd been trained to do. At the elevator he pressed the button and waited. The doors opened almost immediately, as if the hospital had been expecting him. As if it had known all along that he wouldn't leave. He stepped inside, pressed the button for the surgical floor. The doors closed, and Elijah Moore, who had finally been on his way home for Christmas, rode the elevator back up into the fluorescent light and antiseptic air, toward an operating room where a man he had every reason to hate was waiting to be saved. The operating room was bright. Too bright. Elijah had performed hundreds of surgeries, but he never got used to that initial assault of light when he first walked in, the way it bleached out color and shadow, turning everything into stark relief. The patient on the table was just a shape under blue surgical drapes. Human, but barely. Reduced to the problem that needed fixing. Dr. Moore. The scrub nurse looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "I thought you'd left." "I was leaving." Elijah moved to the sink, began the methodical process of scrubbing in, soap, water, the familiar ritual. "What's his status?" The anesthesiologist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Lynn, spoke without looking up from her monitors. "Stable for now, but barely. Severe blockage in the left anterior descending artery. EKG shows ST elevation in multiple leads. He arrested once in the ER, we got him back, but he's fragile." "How long has he been under?" 18 minutes. "Who's assisting?" "I am if you'll have me." Elijah looked up. Dr. James Okoye stood in the doorway, already gowned and gloved. He was a senior resident, competent and calm, the kind of surgeon who didn't need much direction. "Good," Elijah said. "Let's move." He finished scrubbing, dried his hands, and stepped into the sterile gown held open by another nurse. Gloves snapped into place. The world narrowed to the space between his hands and the patient's chest. Richard H. Caldwell, 72 years old, billionaire, philanthropist, the man whose investment decisions had rippled out like stones thrown into water, creating waves that had drowned St. Luke's Hospital and everyone who'd needed it. Elijah looked down at the draped form on the table. From this angle you couldn't tell who it was. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, inside, everyone was the same. Blood and muscle and fragile, stubborn hearts that kept beating until they didn't. "Scalpel," Elijah said. The nurse placed it in his palm. Cold metal. Familiar weight. He made the first incision, a clean line down the center of the chest. Blood welled up, was suctioned away. The sternum came into view, pale bone beneath skin and tissue. Saw, Elijah said. The bone saw whined to life. He worked quickly but carefully, splitting the sternum, spreading the ribs with the retractor. The heart came into view, swollen, struggling, the left ventricle barely contracting. Jesus, James muttered. That's worse than the scans showed. We need to move fast, Elijah said. Get him on bypass. Patricia, how's he doing? Pressure's dropping, 90/60. Stay with me, Mr. Caldwell, Elijah said quietly. To no one, to everyone, to the unconscious man whose life now rested in his hands. The next 40 minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Bypass machine humming, blood circulating outside the body while Elijah worked on the heart itself. He could see the blockage, scar tissue and plaque, years of bad diet or bad genetics or just bad luck. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was clearing it, grafting a new vessel, giving the heart a chance to beat again. Grafts ready, James said, holding up the section of vein they'd harvested from the patient's leg. Good. Let's place it. Elijah's hands moved with a precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. Needle and suture, tiny stitches, each one perfect. The graft went in smoothly, better than he'd hoped. How's the flow? He asked. James used a Doppler probe to check. Strong. Very strong. That's a good anastomosis, Dr. Moore. Check it twice. Already did, it's perfect. Elijah allowed himself a small breath of relief. But the surgery wasn't over. Now came the delicate part, weaning the patient off bypass, seeing if the heart would beat on its own. Patricia, I need you ready with epinephrine if we need it. Standing by. Okay. Elijah looked around the operating room, meeting each person's eyes. Let's bring him back. They reduced the bypass flow gradually, watched as the heart began to fill with blood again. At first it just quivered, a useless twitching. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, it contracted. Once, twice, and then it found its rhythm. We have sinus rhythm, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Pressure's rising. 100/65. Bypass is off. James announced. Elijah watched the heart for another 30 seconds. Steady. Strong. The sutures held. The graft was functioning. Against all odds, Richard H. Caldwell's heart was beating again. Close him up, Elijah said. The rest was routine. Wires to hold the sternum together. Layers of tissue sutured closed. Bandages. By the time they were done, it was nearly 9 o'clock. The surgery had taken just under 3 hours, fast by cardiac standards. Elijah stepped back from the table, his gloves stained with blood, his scrubs soaked with sweat. James was already moving the patient onto the gurney, preparing him for transfer to the ICU. Hell of a job. Dr. Moore, Patricia said. That was textbook. It was adequate. Elijah replied. It was better than adequate, and you know it. Maybe. But Elijah didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollowed out. Empty. He stripped off his gloves, his gown, and walked out of the operating room without another word. The hallway outside was quiet. Night shift. Skeleton crew. He made his way to the surgeon's lounge, collapsed onto one of the worn couches, and closed his eyes. His phone was in his locker. He didn't check it. Didn't want to see the messages he knew would be waiting. He'd saved Richard H. Caldwell's life. The man who'd killed his father. Elijah didn't know how to feel about that. Didn't know if he should feel anything at all. So he sat in the silence and waited for the emptiness to pass. 3 days after Christmas the whispers started. Elijah first noticed them in the doctor's lounge. He'd walked in to grab coffee, bad coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since 6 in the morning, and the conversation at the corner table had stopped mid-sentence. 4 residents all pretending to look at their phones. The silence was thick enough to cut. Morning, Elijah said. Morning, Dr. Moore, one of them mumbled. He poured his coffee and left. Behind him the whispers resumed immediately. By lunchtime he knew why. Did you hear who that was? Richard Caldwell. The Richard Caldwell. I heard Moore volunteered specifically for that surgery. On Christmas Eve. Come on, that's not a coincidence. Elijah stood at the cafeteria entrance, tray in hand, listening to two nurses at the nearest table. They didn't see him. Or maybe they did and didn't care. My cousin works in billing, the first nurse said. She said Caldwell's people already called to discuss the surgeon's fee. Apparently they want to make sure Moore is appropriately compensated for his holiday sacrifice. The second nurse snorted. Bet he is. I'm just saying if I were a surgeon and a billionaire needed emergency surgery, I might suddenly become available too. They laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. Just casually. The way people laugh at gossip that doesn't touch them personally. Elijah set his tray down on an empty table in the corner and ate his sandwich without tasting it. By the next morning, it had spread to the surgical wing. Moore's angling for a donation, someone said in the scrub room. You watch, Caldwell's gonna fund a new wing and name it after him. Smart, honestly. Work one extra shift, get your name on a building. I heard he knew exactly who Caldwell was. That's why he stayed. Elijah kept his head down and scrubbed his hands harder than necessary. But the worst came on the third day, in the main corridor outside the cardiology department. Elijah was reviewing a patient chart when he heard the voice, sharp, loud, and unmistakably directed at him. Well, well, if it isn't the hero of St. Mark's. He looked up. Dr. Vanessa Harrington stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. She was Elijah's age, maybe a year older, a cardiothoracic surgeon with a reputation for brilliance and ruthlessness in equal measure. They'd been competing for the same fellowship position, a prestigious spot that only one of them would get. Dr. Harrington, Elijah said evenly. Oh come on, we're colleagues. She walked closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. I just wanted to congratulate you. That surgery on Christmas Eve. Very impressive. Thank you. Must have been a tough decision. Going back inside after you'd already left. I mean, most of us would have just gone home. Let someone on call handle it. She tilted her head, her smile widening. But I guess when the patient is Richard Caldwell, the rules change. Elijah closed the chart. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying, it's interesting. You've never taken an emergency case when you're off duty. Not once in the 2 years I've known you. But the moment a billionaire's name comes over the speaker, suddenly you're the most dedicated doctor in the building. A small crowd had gathered. Not obviously. Just people slowing down as they walked past. Nurses pretending to check supply closets. Residents suddenly very interested in the bulletin board. Elijah kept his voice level. He needed surgery. No one else was available. I did my job. Your job. Vanessa laughed, and it was a cold sound. Your job was to go home, but I guess the opportunity was too good to pass up, right? I mean, we all know how these things work. Rich patient, heroic surgeon, generous donation to the hospital foundation. Maybe a personal check as a thank you. Who knows, maybe you'll get that fellowship after all. That's enough, is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you made a calculated business decision disguised as altruism. And honestly, I'm just calling it what it is. Elijah's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to defend himself. To explain. To tell her, tell all of them, why he'd really stayed. But the words stuck in his throat. Because how could he explain? How could he possibly make them understand? I stayed because I wanted to save the man who killed my father. I stayed because I needed to look him in the eye afterward and ask him why. I stayed because I'm not sure whether I'm a good person or just someone pretending to be one. He couldn't say any of that. So he said nothing. Nothing to say. Vanessa's voice was almost gentle now, almost pitying. That's what I thought. She turned and walked away, her heels echoing down the corridor. The crowd dispersed slowly, people drifting back to their work with sidelong glances and whispered conversations. Elijah stood alone in the hallway, the patient chart still in his hands, and felt the weight of their judgment settle over him like a lid blanket. The rumors didn't stop. Over the next week they grew. Mutated. Spread like an infection through every department. I heard Caldwell's lawyers are already drawing up paperwork. Moore's gonna be set for life, must be nice. The rest of us save lives every day and nobody writes us a check. Elijah endured it. He came to work. He did his rounds. He performed surgeries, and he said nothing. Because what could he say? The truth sounded like a lie. And the lie sounded like the truth. So he stayed silent, and the silence, as it turned out, was the loudest condemnation of all. The house smelled like vanilla and old wood, the way it always had. Elijah stood in the doorway for a moment, his keys still in his hand, letting the warmth wash over him. It was late, nearly 11 at night, and he'd driven home on autopilot, his mind somewhere else entirely. The living room light was on. His mother was awake. Of course she was. Elijah, her voice came from the kitchen. Soft. Patient. No accusation in it, even though he'd missed Christmas dinner for the 8th year in a row. Even though he'd promised this time would be different. He closed the door behind him and walked through the small living room, same couch he'd sat on as a kid. Same bookshelves his father had built by hand, same framed photos on the wall. His high school graduation, his medical school white coat ceremony, his parents on their wedding day, young and laughing and impossibly hopeful. His mother stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She was 61 years old, shorter than he remembered, her hair more gray than black now. She wore her favorite cardigan, the blue one with the wooden buttons, and worn slippers that made soft shuffling sounds on the linoleum. "Mom," Elijah said. "You didn't have to wait up." She turned and her face lit up the way it always did when she saw him. No matter how long he'd been gone, no matter how many promises he'd broken. "Baby boy," she said and opened her arms. Elijah crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and let her hug him. She barely came up to his chest now, but her embrace was still the strongest thing he knew. She smelled like cocoa butter and peppermint tea and home. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder. "I'm so sorry." "Hush now." She patted his back. "You're here now. That's what matters. But I promised, and you had an emergency." "I understand, Elijah. I've always understood." She pulled back and cupped his face in her hands. Her palms were warm, rough from years of working as a seamstress. Her eyes, deep brown, same as his, searched his face with the kind of knowing that only mothers possess. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired. Sit down. I kept some soup warm." "Mom, you don't have to." "Sit." It wasn't a request. Elijah sat. His mother ladled soup into a bowl, chicken and rice, his favorite, and set it in front of him with a spoon and a napkin. Then she poured 2 mugs of tea and sat down across from him. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Elijah ate slowly, each bite a small act of contrition. "They're talking about me at work," he said finally. His mother sipped her tea. "Who is?" "Everyone. They think I stayed on Christmas Eve because the patient was rich. They think I did it for money." He set down his spoon. "They think I don't know, opportunistic. Fake. Are you?" The question was gentle, but it hit like a punch. "No," Elijah said. "God, no. I stayed because he stopped." Swallowed. "I stayed because it was the right thing to do." "Then that's all that matters. But they don't believe me." "Does that change what you did?" "No, but it makes me look like I'm lying." His mother reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Elijah. Baby, listen to me. You saved a life. That's what you're supposed to do. What people say about it, that's not your burden to carry." "It feels like my burden." "I know it does, but it's not." She squeezed his hand. "Your father used to say something. You remember?" Elijah nodded. "He said a lot of things. He said, the only opinion that matters is the one you see in the mirror. You remember that?" "Yeah." "Do you believe it?" Elijah looked down at his soup. His reflection wavered on the surface, distorted, unclear. "I don't know what I believe anymore." His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around his shoulders from behind. She rested her chin on top of his head, the way she used to when he was small. "Then believe this," she said softly. "You are a good man, you do good work. And anyone who can't see that, well, that's their failing, not yours." Elijah closed his eyes, felt the sting of tears he wouldn't let fall. What if they're right? What if part of me did want something from staying? What if I'm not as good as you think I am? "Oh baby." Her voice was infinitely tender. "None of us are as good as we want to be. We're all just doing our best with what we've got. The fact that you're even asking these questions, that tells me everything I need to know about who you are." She kissed the top of his head and stepped back. Elijah opened his eyes, wiped them quickly with the heel of his hand. "Finish your soup," his mother said. "Then get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to come whether you're ready or not." "Yeah," Elijah said. "I know," but he didn't feel ready. He didn't feel like he'd ever be ready for what was coming. Still, as he sat in his mother's kitchen, eating soup and drinking tea, and listening to her hum an old hymn, while she washed dishes, Elijah felt something loosen in his chest. Not resolution, not peace, but something close to hope. The hospital lobby was never truly quiet, but it had lulls, moments when the usual chaos ebbed just enough to hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant beep of monitors. This was one of those moments. Elijah stood near the main entrance, reviewing a patient's chart on his tablet, when he heard the voice. "Must be nice to have friends in high places." He looked up. Dr. Vanessa Harrington stood 15 feet away, flanked by 2 other surgeons, both department heads, both people whose opinions carried weight. She held a coffee cup in one hand, her expression somewhere between amusement and contempt. Elijah closed his tablet. "Excuse me," I said. "It must be nice, having connections, doing favors for billionaires. Really smart career move. More. I'm almost impressed." One of the department heads, Dr. Stevens, a gray-haired man with 30 years of experience, frowned. "Vanessa, this isn't the place." "No, it's fine." Elijah's voice was calm. Too calm. If Dr. Harrington has something to say, she should say it. "Oh, I've been saying it for days now, but since you're finally paying attention." Vanessa stepped closer. "Let's be honest. You didn't stay on Christmas Eve because of some noble calling. You stayed because you heard a name. Richard Caldwell, one of the richest men in the state. And you saw an opportunity." "That's not true. Isn't it funny how you've never volunteered for emergency surgery before? Funny how you were literally walking out the door until you heard who the patient was." "I stayed because no one else was available." "Bullshit." Vanessa's smile was razor sharp. "You stayed because you wanted something. Money, recognition, a name on a plaque. Whatever it is rich people give to doctors who save their lives." Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not anger, something else, something worse. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly. "Don't I? Everyone in this hospital knows exactly what you did, and frankly it's pathetic. Pretending to be this noble self-sacrificing doctor when really you're just enough." The voice was loud, commanding. And it didn't come from Elijah. Marcus Chen pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, his face flushed, his jaw set. Elijah barely recognized him. Marcus, who never raised his voice, who avoided conflict like a disease, was shaking with anger. "Marcus," Elijah said. "Don't. No, I'm done." Marcus turned to face Vanessa and the others. "You want to know why Dr. Moore stayed on Christmas Eve? You really want to know?" "Marcus, he stayed because of a name." "You're right about that, but not for the reason you think." Marcus's voice carried through the lobby now, drawing more attention. Nurses stopped mid-stride. Visitors looked up from their phones. "Richard Caldwell. That name means something to Elijah. It means something very specific." Elijah felt his chest tighten. "Marcus, stop." But Marcus wasn't stopping. He was looking directly at Vanessa now, his words coming fast and sharp. 12 years ago, Richard Caldwell's investment group pulled funding from St. Luke's County Hospital. You know what happened after that? The hospital closed its cardiac unit. They couldn't afford the equipment, couldn't pay the staff. And 8 months later, a man named Thomas Moore had a heart attack. He made it to the hospital, but there was no one to help him, no proper equipment. He died in a waiting room. The lobby had gone completely silent. Thomas Moore, Marcus continued, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, was Elijah's father. Someone gasped. Elijah closed his eyes. "So yeah," Marcus said. Elijah heard the name, Richard Caldwell. And yeah, he went back inside, but not because he wanted money, not because he wanted recognition. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He went back because he wanted to save the man who killed his father. Because that's who he is, that's who he's always been. And if you can't see that, if any of you can't see that, then you don't deserve to work in the same building as him. Marcus turned away, his hands shaking. He looked at Elijah, and there was something raw and apologetic in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I know you didn't want me to say anything. But I couldn't just stand here and let them." Elijah put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. It's not okay. It is." Elijah's voice was steady, even if nothing else was. "Thank you." He turned to face the crowd, dozens of faces all staring at him. Some shocked, some skeptical, some starting to understand. And in the back, near the entrance to the executive wing, stood a man Elijah recognized from photographs. Tall, gray-haired, expensively dressed. Richard H. Caldwell. Richard H. Caldwell had been on his way to a meeting with the hospital board. Something routine, budget allocations, equipment purchases, the kind of administrative details that kept a medical center running. He'd been checking his phone, only half present, when he'd heard the commotion in the lobby. At first he'd planned to walk past. Hospital drama wasn't his concern. He donated money, attended fundraisers, cut ribbons at building dedications. That was the extent of his involvement. But then he'd heard his own name. Richard Caldwell's investment group pulled funding from St. Luke's County Hospital. He'd stopped, turned slightly, listened, and as Marcus Chen's voice had risen, angry, defensive, protective, Caldwell had heard a story he didn't remember. Or rather, a story he'd never bothered to learn. The hospital closed its cardiac unit. A man named Thomas Moore had a heart attack. He died in a waiting room. Caldwell had stood frozen, hidden partially behind a tall display case advertising the hospital's charity gala. His hands had gone cold. His carefully constructed schedule, the meeting, the lunch afterward, the conference call at 2, had dissolved into irrelevance. Thomas Moore was Elijah's father. Elijah watched him go and felt something shift inside him. Not closure, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The silence in the lobby stretched for another heartbeat. Then people began to move again. Slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Vanessa Harrington stood frozen, her coffee cup forgotten in her hand. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the elevators. Dr. Stevens approached Elijah, his expression grave. "Dr. Moore, I had no idea. Most people don't," Elijah said. "If there's anything the department can do, there's nothing. But thank you." Stevens nodded and walked away, leaving Elijah and Marcus alone in the middle of the lobby. "I really am sorry," Marcus said again. "I know you wanted to keep that private." Elijah looked at his friend, this man who'd broken a confidence to protect him. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" "Yeah, you did." They stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Then Marcus clapped Elijah on the shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here before someone else decides to have an opinion." "Good idea." They walked toward the exit together. Behind them, the hospital continued its endless cycle of healing and hurting, of living and dying, of truth and lies and all the messy spaces in between. And somewhere in that building, a billionaire was learning that the man who'd saved his life had every reason to let him die. Richard H. Caldwell sat in his private office on the hospital's executive floor, staring at a file he'd requested 3 hours ago. Outside the window, the city sprawled beneath a gray January sky. Inside, the office was warm, expensive, insulated from the world. But Caldwell didn't feel insulated. He felt exposed. The file on his desk was thick. Years of financial records, board meeting minutes, correspondence, all of it related to the St. Luke's County Hospital project, a project he'd buried in his memory under layers of other deals, other decisions, other days, until an hour ago, when a young doctor's friend had shouted the truth in a hospital lobby for everyone to hear. Thomas Moore died in a waiting room. Caldwell closed his eyes, rubbed his temples. He was 72 years old. He'd built an empire, made and lost fortunes, employed thousands, donated millions. He'd done good things, he told himself. Important things. But he'd also made choices. The intercom on his desk buzzed. His assistant's voice. "Mr. Caldwell, your 2 o'clock is here. Cancel it, sir. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. I don't want to be disturbed." A pause. "Of course, sir." The line went dead. Caldwell opened the file again and began to read. Project, St. Luke's Municipal Health Initiative. Date, March 15, 13 years ago, Caldwell Investment Group, preliminary funding agreement. He remembered this, sort of. The city had approached his investment group about funding a community health program. St. Luke's County Hospital was the centerpiece, a public hospital that served neighborhoods where people couldn't afford private insurance. The pitch had been compelling. Invest in the community, reduce emergency room overcrowding, improve public health outcomes. It was good business, good optics, the kind of thing that got you featured in Forbes with a headline about conscious capitalism. Caldwell had signed on. $5 million over 3 years, with options to extend. But then he flipped through the pages, found the memo he was looking for. Internal memo, CFO to board members. Date, August 9, 11 years ago, Remo St. Luke's Investment, recommended action. Gentlemen, our quarterly review of the St. Luke's project shows concerning trends. Patient volume is higher than projected, but reimbursement rates are lower. The hospital is serving primarily uninsured or underinsured populations. Return on investment is significantly below projections. Recommendation: redirect funding to more profitable healthcare ventures. Suggested allocation: Mercy Heights Medical Center expansion. Projected ROI 18 to 22%. Action item: withdraw funding from St. Luke's by Q4. Caldwell remembered the meeting. The CFO had presented the numbers. The board had agreed unanimously. It was a sound financial decision. St. Luke's was a money sink. Mercy Heights was a gold mine. They'd pulled the funding. 6 months later, St. Luke's had announced the closure of its cardiac unit. Caldwell had moved on to other projects, other investments. The decision had been buried under 1,000 other decisions, each one equally rational, equally justified by the numbers. He kept reading. There were news clippings in the file. Articles from the local paper about St. Luke's closing, letters from community members, begging the city to intervene. A petition with 8,000 signatures, and then buried near the back of the file, a small article from 12 years ago. Local postal worker dies after delayed care. Thomas Moore, 55, passed away Monday evening after suffering a heart attack. Moore was transported to St. Luke's County Hospital but died before receiving treatment. Family members say the hospital was understaffed and lacked proper cardiac equipment. They did everything they could, said his wife Lorraine Moore. But there just weren't enough people, not enough machines. My husband needed help, and there was no one there to help him. Moore is survived by his wife and son Elijah, a medical student. Caldwell set the paper down. His hands were shaking slightly. Elijah Moore, medical student, now a cardiothoracic surgeon. The man who'd saved his life. Caldwell stood and walked to the window. Below, people moved like ants, getting coffee, going to appointments, living their lives, unaware that a man on the 15th floor was finally understanding the cost of his choices. He'd pulled funding because the numbers didn't make sense. But numbers weren't people. Numbers didn't wait in emergency rooms. Numbers didn't hold their chests and gasp for air. Numbers didn't have wives, or sons. Thomas Moore wasn't a number, but Caldwell had treated him like one. Another document caught his eye, a bank statement from 11 years ago, the month after the funding was withdrawn. He'd noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much of it. Now he looked closer. St. Luke's Health Initiative, account balance, $0. That was wrong. They'd already paid $2 million into the program by that point. The money should have been in the account. Caldwell flipped through more pages, found the transfer records. Transfer to Mercy Heights Medical Center expansion amount $2 million, authorized by David Pembroke, CFO. Wait. Caldwell sat down hard. Read it again. The money hadn't just been redirected. It had been transferred before the board vote. Before they'd officially decided to pull funding, he grabbed the phone on his desk, dialed a number from memory. Accounting. This is Rita. Rita, it's Richard Caldwell. I need you to pull every transaction related to the St. Luke's project, everything from 11 years ago until it closed. Sir, that's a lot of, I don't care how much it is. I need it on my desk by tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. He hung up, stared at the file. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for years and he'd never noticed because he'd been too busy chasing the next deal, the next acquisition, the next quarter's earnings. David Pembroke, his CFO at the time, a man Caldwell had trusted completely, a man who'd recommended pulling funding from a public hospital and redirecting it to a private one where Caldwell's blood went cold, where Pembroke's brother-in-law sat on the board. He reached for his phone again. This time he called his lawyer. Gordon, it's Richard. I need you to look into something, quietly. I think someone embezzled funds from one of our charitable projects. Which one? St. Luke's County Hospital, about 11 years ago. A pause. Richard, that's outside the statute of limitations for most. I don't care about the statute of limitations. I care about the truth. Can you do it? Of course. But why now? Caldwell looked at the newspaper clipping, at Thomas Moore's name. Because I just found out someone died because I didn't do my due diligence, he said quietly. And I need to know if I was negligent or if I was lied to. I'll get started immediately. Caldwell hung up. He sat in his office for another hour reading and rereading the documents, building a picture of what had happened. By the time his assistant knocked on the door to say she was leaving for the day, he knew. David Pembroke had redirected the St. Luke's funds before the board vote, had falsified reports to make the hospital look like a bad investment, had pocketed kickbacks from Mercy Heights for steering the money their way, and Richard Caldwell, who'd prided himself on being a careful, conscientious businessman, had signed off on it all without a second glance, because he'd been too busy, too distracted, too certain that his people would never lie to him, but they had. And a man had died, and that man's son had grown up to save the life of the person, however indirectly, who'd killed his father. Caldwell stood, put on his coat and walked out of his office. He had calls to make, lawyers to consult, investigations to launch, but first he had something else to do, something harder. He had to find Dr. Elijah Moore and tell him the truth. The hospital auditorium was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the kind of crowd that gathered when something important was about to happen. At the front of the room, a panel of 5 senior physicians sat behind a long table, their expressions grave. This was the day they'd announced the recipient of the Cardiovascular Excellence Fellowship, a year-long position that came with prestige, resources, and a clear path to department leadership. Elijah sat 3 rows from the front, his hands folded in his lap, his face carefully neutral. Next to him, Marcus shifted nervously. "They're taking forever," Marcus whispered. "It's been 5 minutes. Feels like 5 hours. Elijah didn't respond. He was watching the panel, trying to read their body language. Dr. Stevens, the department head, was looking at his notes. Dr. Patricia Lynn, the anesthesiologist, was whispering to the person next to her. And seated at the far end, arms crossed, was Dr. Vanessa Harrington. She'd been added to the selection committee 2 days ago. A last-minute procedural adjustment, according to the official memo. Elijah knew what it really meant. She was there to vote against him. Dr. Stevens cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," Stevens said. "As you know, the Cardiovascular Excellence Fellowship is one of our most prestigious awards. The selection process is rigorous. We evaluate not only clinical skill but also character, ethics, and commitment to our core values." Marcus nudged Elijah's arm. "He's looking at you. He's looking at everyone." "No, he's definitely." This year, Stevens continued, "we had 2 exceptional candidates. Both demonstrated remarkable surgical skill. Both have impressive records. But the fellowship can only go to one person." Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going. "However," Stevens said, and his tone shifted, "before we announce our decision, there's something we need to address." The room stirred. Confused murmurs. Stevens glanced to his left. "Dr. Harrington has raised concerns about one of our candidates. Concerns regarding professional conduct and ethical judgment. Given the seriousness of these allegations, we felt it was important to address them publicly." Vanessa leaned toward her microphone. She looked calm. satisfied. Thank you, Dr. Stevens. I want to be clear, this isn't personal. But we have a responsibility to ensure that the doctors representing this institution exemplify our highest standards. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on Elijah. Dr. Moore's surgical skills are not in question, she said, but his judgment is. 3 weeks ago he chose to accept an emergency surgery on Christmas Eve. On the surface this seems admirable, but the context matters. The patient was Richard Caldwell, a billionaire with significant resources, and Dr. Moore, who has never volunteered for an off-duty emergency before, suddenly decided to stay. The murmurs grew louder. Elijah forced himself to stay still. I'm not accusing Dr. Moore of wrongdoing, Vanessa continued, her voice sweet with false concern. I'm simply saying that when a physician's decisions appear to be influenced by a patient's wealth or status, we have to question whether that physician can be trusted to treat all patients equally. And that's not the kind of doctor we want leading our fellowship program. She sat back, her piece said. The room erupted in whispers. Stevens raised a hand for quiet. Dr. Harrington's concerns are noted. However, the auditorium doors at the back of the room opened. Every head turned. Richard H. Caldwell walked in. He was dressed impeccably, dark suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. His silver hair was neat, his expression unreadable. 2 people followed him, a woman with a briefcase, presumably his lawyer, and a younger man holding a folder. The room went utterly silent. Caldwell walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing. When he reached the front, he turned to face the panel. Dr. Stevens, he said. His voice was clear, commanding. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have information relevant to your deliberations. Stevens blinked. Mr. Caldwell, I'm not sure this is the appropriate. It's about Dr. Moore, Caldwell said. And about me, and about a lie that's been told for far too long. He turned to face the audience. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him. 3 weeks ago, Caldwell began. Dr. Elijah Moore saved my life. He performed emergency bypass surgery on Christmas Eve. He did it flawlessly, and afterward, I learned something about him, something that makes his choice to stay that night, not opportunistic but extraordinary. He paused. The silence was absolute. 12 years ago, Caldwell continued, my investment group pulled funding from St. Luke's County Hospital. It was presented to me as a sound business decision. The hospital was losing money. The return on investment was poor. I approved the withdrawal. His voice didn't waver, but something in his face shifted. Regret, shame. 6 months later, St. Luke's closed its cardiac unit, and 8 months after that a man named Thomas Moore had a heart attack. He went to St. Luke's. There was no equipment, no staff. He died waiting for help. Someone in the audience gasped. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Thomas Moore was Dr. Elijah Moore's father. The room exploded. Shouts, gasps, people turning to stare at Elijah, who sat frozen in his seat. Caldwell raised his voice to be heard over the chaos. Dr. Moore knew who I was when he heard my name. He knew I was connected to his father's death, and he came back anyway. Not because he wanted money, not because he wanted recognition, but because he's a doctor, and doctors save lives, even the lives of people who've hurt them. Vanessa Harrington's face had gone pale. That doesn't change the fact that I'm not finished. Caldwell's tone was ice. He gestured to the young man with the folder. This is my investigator. Over the past week he's been reviewing the financial records from the St. Luke's project, and he found something interesting. The investigator stepped forward and handed Caldwell a document. My CFO at the time, Caldwell said, was a man named David Pembroke. He recommended pulling funding from St. Luke's, but what he didn't tell me, what I didn't know until 5 days ago, is that he'd already redirected the money before I approved it. $2 million transferred to Mercy Heights Medical Center, a hospital where Pembroke's brother-in-law sat on the board of directors. He held up the document. Pembroke falsified reports. He made St. Luke's look like a failing investment so he could funnel money to Mercy Heights and collect kickbacks. And I was too busy, too trusting to notice. Dr. Stevens leaned forward. Mr. Caldwell, are you saying? I'm saying I was deceived. St. Luke's could have survived if the money had gone where it was supposed to go, but it didn't. And a good man died because of it. Caldwell's voice cracked, just slightly. I can't undo that. I can't bring Thomas Moore back, but I can tell you this, The man who saved my life knowing what I'd done is a better human being than I will ever be. He turned to look directly at Elijah. Dr. Moore, Caldwell said, I am more sorry than I can possibly express, for your father, for my negligence, for the years you've carried this. I can't ask for your forgiveness, but I can tell everyone in this room that if you lose this fellowship because of me, it will be the greatest injustice I've ever witnessed. Elijah couldn't speak, couldn't move. He felt Marcus's hand on his shoulder grounding him. Caldwell turned back to the panel. That's all I came to say. I'll let you continue your deliberations. He walked back up the aisle, his lawyer and investigator following. The doors closed behind them with a soft thud. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Dr. Stevens cleared his throat. I think he said carefully, we need to reconvene. Dr. Harrington, given what we've just heard, do you wish to withdraw your objection? Vanessa sat frozen, her face ashen. Finally she shook her head. No, I was wrong, completely wrong. Stevens nodded. Then I believe we have our answer. He looked out at the audience. At Elijah. The recipient of this year's Cardiovascular Excellence Fellowship is Dr. Elijah Moore. The room erupted in applause. People stood. Marcus grabbed Elijah in a bear hug. Voices shouted congratulations, but Elijah barely heard any of it. All he could think about was a billionaire standing in front of a crowd and saying, I was wrong. Sometimes he realized, justice didn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looked like truth. 6 months later, Elijah stood in the lobby of a building that shouldn't exist. It was a hospital, brand new, 4 stories of glass and steel and hope. The sign outside read, St. Luke's Community Medical Center. No name of a donor, no corporate sponsor, just a promise. Free healthcare for anyone who walked through the doors. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Elijah turned. Richard Caldwell stood beside him, hands in his pockets, looking up at the building. He'd aged in the past half year, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. But there was something lighter about him too, something unburdened. It's more than amazing, Elijah said. It's what should have been built 12 years ago. Caldwell's voice was quiet. I can't change the past, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again. They'd spoken a few times since that day in the auditorium. Careful conversations, tentative, feeling out the boundaries of what this new relationship could be. Not friendship, not exactly forgiveness, understanding maybe. I still don't know why you're doing this, Elijah said. Don't you? Caldwell looked at him. A man I never met died because I wasn't paying attention, and his son grew up and saved my life anyway. That's not something you just move on from. So this is guilt, partly, but it's also, Caldwell gestured at the building. It's trying to be the person I thought I was, the person I should have been all along. Before Elijah could respond, a woman's voice called out, Dr. Moore. He turned. A woman in her 50s approached, tears streaming down her face. Behind her a young man in a wheelchair, early 20s, dark hair, oxygen cannula in his nose. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said, but I wanted to thank you. My son Carlos, he had surgery here last week. Heart valve replacement. The doctors said if we'd waited another month. She couldn't finish the sentence. Elijah knelt beside the wheelchair. Carlos, how are you feeling? Tired, the young man said, but he was smiling. But good, really good. You're healing well. The doctors say I can go back to school next semester. That's wonderful. The mother grabbed Elijah's hand. They told us about this place. Free care for anyone who needs it. I thought it was too good to be true. But it's real. It's real, and my son is alive because of it. She pulled Elijah into a hug, fierce and grateful. When she let go she was sobbing. Carlos reached up and squeezed Elijah's shoulder. Thank you, Carlos said, for everything. They moved on, the mother pushing the wheelchair toward the exit, both of them talking quietly, both of them whole. Elijah watched them go, felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. That, Caldwell said softly, is why I'm doing this. Elijah nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. They stood together in the lobby, watching patients and families move through the space. An elderly man getting his blood pressure checked, a pregnant woman talking to a nurse, a child with a broken arm, wincing but brave. They offered me a plaque, Caldwell said after a while, for the main entrance, funded by Richard H. Caldwell or some such nonsense. What did you say? I said no, this isn't about my name. It's about making sure what happened to your father never happens to anyone else. He paused. Besides, the building already has the right name, St. Luke's, named after the patron saint of physicians, and coincidentally, the hospital where Thomas More had died. He would have liked this, Elijah said. Your father, yeah, he always said. Elijah's voice caught. He cleared his throat. He always said the measure of a person isn't what they have, it's what they give. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, then he said, I wish I could have met him. So do I. They stood there a while longer. Then Caldwell extended his hand. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for saving my life, and for teaching me what it means to be human. Elijah shook his hand. Thank you for listening. Caldwell nodded and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Elijah watched him go, this man who'd been a villain in his story, and was now, what? Not a hero, but maybe a person trying to do better. That was enough. Elijah's phone buzzed, a text from his mother. How's the new hospital? He smiled and typed back, perfect. Dad would love it. He would. So do I. Come home for dinner tonight. I will. Promise. And this time he meant it. Elijah pocketed his phone and looked around the lobby one more time. At the patients being helped, the families reunited, the lives being saved by doctors who cared more about people than profit. This was why he'd become a surgeon. Not for the money, not for the recognition. For moments like this, for Carlos and his mother, for every person who walked through these doors and found hope instead of despair. His father had died in a waiting room, but his son had helped build a place where no one would have to die waiting again. That wasn't redemption. Not exactly, but it was close. Elijah Moore turned and walked toward the exit. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass doors, warm on his face. Outside, the city moved and breathed and lived. And inside, the hospital his father had needed, the one that should have existed all along, finally did. The morning sun filtered through the windows of St. Luke's Community Medical Center, casting long golden strips across the waiting room floor. Elijah Moore stood at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, reviewing a chart, when he heard the familiar shuffle of footsteps behind him. Dr. Moore, you have a visitor. He turned. The receptionist pointed toward the small consultation room at the end of the hall. Through the glass window, Elijah could see a young man, maybe 27-28, sitting nervously in one of the chairs. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, a folder clutched in both hands. Elijah set down his chart and walked to the room. When he opened the door, the young man stood immediately, his posture rigid with nerves. Dr. Moore, I'm sorry to show up without an appointment. I tried calling but, he stopped, swallowed hard. My name is David. David Pembroke. The name hit Elijah like a physical blow. Pembroke, the CFO who'd embezzled the St. Luke's funds. The man whose greed had set everything in motion. I'm his son, David said quickly, as if reading Elijah's thoughts. My father, he died 2 years ago, cancer. Before he passed, he wrote some letters. This one is for you. He held out an envelope, yellowed, sealed. Elijah's name written in shaky handwriting across the front. Elijah took it slowly. Why are you bringing this now? Because I didn't know what to do with it. I was angry at my father for what he'd done. Ashamed. I moved across the country, changed my name back to my mother's maiden name, tried to pretend I wasn't his son. David's voice cracked. But then I got sick. Heart condition, genetic, they think. I needed surgery, and when I came here, when I saw what this place was, what it stood for, he gestured around. I realized my father's worst mistake helped create something beautiful, and I thought you deserved to know he was sorry. Really, truly sorry. Elijah looked down at the envelope. His hands were steady, they always were, but his heart was pounding. Thank you for bringing this, he said quietly. David nodded. There's one more thing. I'm a financial analyst now, nothing like what my father did. I work for a non-profit. We help underserved communities set up healthcare programs, and I wondered if, he hesitated, if St. Luke's ever needs help with grant applications or funding proposals, I'd like to volunteer. No pay, just I want to help fix what my father broke. Elijah studied the young man in front of him. He saw shame there, guilt, but also determination, the desire to be better than the name he'd been born with. We could use someone like that, Elijah said. David's eyes widened. Really, really. Talk to administration downstairs. Tell them I sent you. Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you so much. David shook his hand, grip firm, grateful, and left quickly, as if afraid Elijah might change his mind. Alone in the consultation room, Elijah sat down and opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, written in the same shaky hand. Dr. Moore, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I did cost your father his life, and no words can change that. I was greedy, selfish. I put money over people, and I have carried that shame every day since. But I want you to know what you did, saving Richard Caldwell, building this hospital, showing mercy when you had every right to show anger. It changed something in me. It made me see who I'd become. And in my final months, I tried to be better. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But maybe my son can finish what I should have started. I'm sorry for everything. David Pembroke Sr. Elijah folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. He sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Not closure, exactly, but something close. His phone buzzed, a text from his mother. Sunday dinner. Your favorite. Don't be late. He smiled and typed back, I won't, I promise. Through the window he could see the waiting room. A mother holding a sleeping baby, an elderly couple sitting hand in hand, a teenager with a cast on his leg, laughing at something on his phone. All of them here, all of them being cared for. Because 12 years ago, a man had died waiting, and because his son had refused to let that death be meaningless. Elijah stood, tucked the letter into his pocket, and walked back to the nurse's station. There were patients to see, lives to save, work to do, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Peace. Not because the past had been erased, but because the future, this future, built on grace and second chances, and the belief that people could be better, was finally here. And it was worth every sacrifice.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.